From a single image of a deserted rail site, Jasmine Crockett uncovered the largest political money laundering scheme in California history and turned a powerful governor into a federal defendant. No workers, no equipment, just rusted steel and a $1.2 billion contract sent to a mailbox in Texas. 30 subpoenas, 12 fake companies, one offshore campaign account in the Cayman Islands. How did Jasmine Crockett, a black attorney once written off as an outsider, expose a $33 billion criminal network and bring the state's most powerful man to his knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Situation Room was silent, too silent for a building that usually buzzed with controlled chaos. The overhead lights cast a cold, sterile glow on the table, where Jasmine Crockett sat alone, her fingers resting on a sealed manila folder labeled Confidential Urgent Federal Disbursement Report. The room smelled faintly of ink and steel, like truth waiting to be unsealed. When she finally opened the file, her eyes scanned the first page, and her pulse immediately spiked. $33 billion. That was the number staring back at her, allocated to California's high-speed rail project. But underneath, in glaring contrast, another figure. 0 miles of track laid. 10 years. 33 billion. Nothing. Not even the whisper of a foundation, let alone a functioning rail. Her hand gripped the file tighter, knuckles whitening, the tension in her jaw screaming louder than the silence around her. She flipped to the next page. Addresses, dozens of them. Contractors supposedly paid millions. But Jasmine had seen this before. Fraud dressed up in bureaucratic camouflage. As she read further, her eyes sharpened like a blade drawn from its sheath. Empty lots, P.O. boxes, mail forwarding services. No employees, no office buildings. Just ghost companies feeding off federal funds like parasites in tailored suits. Every line item in the report felt like another slap in the face. Not to her ego, but to the American taxpayer. These weren't just accounting errors. They were insults carved into the very concept of public service. Jasmine sat back, breath steady but eyes burning. I want every dollar traced, every lie exposed, every name brought forward, she said, voice low and lethal. In that moment, she didn't sound like an advisor. She sounded like a prosecutor ready to dismantle an empire. The moment Jasmine closed the folder and uttered those cold, deliberate words, I want every dollar traced, every lie exposed, every name brought forward. Washington shifted. The machine began to turn. Within hours, encrypted lines lit up. Files were duplicated and assignments dispatched. But there was one task she entrusted to a single man. Not because he was expendable, but because he had seen war, smelled deceit, and never blinked at the truth. Sean Duffy, Secretary of Transportation, wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was a former Marine turned fixer for the federal government. When systems failed, when projects collapsed under the weight of their own lies, he was the one they sent in, not to rebuild, but to bury the truth with precision. Only this time, he wasn't there to cover it up. He was there to dig it out. 2 days later, his SUV rolled through the dry outskirts of Fresno. The landscape looked scorched, not just by the sun, but by time itself. Officially, this was Site C of the California High-Speed Rail Initiative, a project once hailed as the most ambitious transportation endeavor in the Western Hemisphere. The future of green transit, the symbol of American progress. But what met his eyes was a carcass, a dead promise left to rot under a blistering sky. A twisted metal skeleton sprawled across cracked concrete, forgotten pylons stretching out like the ribs of a fallen titan. Half-built foundations that looked like they'd never been touched since the first concrete pour, if that pour had ever happened at all. Duffy stepped out, his boots sinking into powdery dust. The smell in the air wasn't industrial. It was metallic and stale, the stench of something long abandoned but never buried. He walked slowly across the site, the wind dragging along faded plastic sheeting like ghosts from a better version of this place. Scaffolding leaned like drunk skeletons. Shipping containers marked Equip Zone A sat rusting shut, locked with chains that hadn't been touched in years. Not a single soul in sight. No supervisors, no workers, no engineers, just heat and silence. He reached a bent safety first were sign hanging sideways on a leaning fence, the slogan now a cruel joke. Nearby, rebar twisted like vines clawing their way out of the ground, evidence of a phase that never advanced. A plan that never matured beyond the invoice. And yet $33 billion had disappeared here, into the sun and dirt, into nothing. Then a voice cracked the stillness. "You lost, mister?" Duffy turned. A man stood in the shadow of a rusted steel beam, arms crossed over a dirty reflective vest. His face was lined with sun, sweat, and something deeper, betrayal. His hands were calloused, fingernails blackened by work he no longer did. "Or are you just here to check off another box?" Duffy didn't answer right away. He simply walked toward the man, recording every step with his chest cam. "I'm not here to check boxes," he said flatly. "I'm here for Jasmine Crockett." The man exhaled slowly, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then you're about 5 years too late. They gutted this place, promised the world, left us with debt and dust." The worker pulled a battered thermos from a nearby concrete block and sat down like a man who'd told this story too many times to care anymore. "They told us we were part of something historic, said we'd be remembered." He gestured out at the decaying site. "Well, here it is, your legacy. You want to know where the money went?" He leaned down and scooped up a handful of dirt, letting it trickle through his fingers. "It's here, mixed with our sweat, our broken backs, and the lies they poured over it like cement." Duffy didn't speak. He simply looked around, recording it all, absorbing the weight. This wasn't mismanagement. It was betrayal weaponized through contracts and hidden behind permits. The man pointed at a half-built bridge span. "That thing," they put up one section, took the photos for the press, then packed up and ghosted. Every damn crew that came after just cleaned, posed, and left. We never laid track, not 1 inch. But the checks, those cleared every time. His voice grew darker. "You know how many families were promised health care with this job? How many people sunk their savings moving here thinking this would be the job that changed their life?" He stood up slowly, eyes sharp now. Instead, they got evicted when the pay stopped. Their kids dropped out of school. Some of the guys started drinking again. One of them, he put a nail gun to his temple last year. His voice cracked. "But yeah, tell Washington thanks for the opportunity." Duffy's breath hitched, just once. He dealt with failing bridges, collapsing contracts, and the rot of bureaucracy before. But this was human wreckage, dressed up in policy language. He looked down at the cracked concrete beneath his feet, then back up at the sunburned man before him. "What's your name, Oni?" he asked. "Does it matter?" The man replied, bitter. "The ones who signed this mess off already forgot mine." Then after a beat, he muttered, "Tell Crockett we remember, and we're watching." Duffy nodded silently, turned on his heel and headed back to the SUV. The encrypted transmission arrived just after midnight. Jasmine Crockett had been waiting, still in her office, the glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across stacks of documents and open case files. Her phone buzzed once. Duffy upload complete. She tapped the tablet beside her, and the screen lit up with images that made her jaw clench and her heart hammer in her chest. There it was. Rusted scaffolding, half-built bridges, abandoned machinery, and barren land where $33 billion was supposed to live. A silent testimony to the betrayal buried beneath bureaucracy. The footage Duffy captured played without narration. It didn't need one. Every frame screamed corruption. Every second of silence felt louder than sirens. Jasmine's eyes locked on one photo, a rusted steel beam with a torn safety banner sagging beside it. A monument to decay, built not from stone, but from lies. Her mind raced. This wasn't just fraud. This was a calculated dismantling of public trust, carried out in slow motion and hidden behind the smoke of progress. She zoomed into one of the invoices attached to the images. The company name was familiar, Silent Consulting, but she'd seen it listed 3 years ago in an unrelated campaign finance probe. It didn't have an office then either. Her pulse quickened, not from panic, but from that specific kind of clarity only truth provides. They weren't just stealing. They were laundering money through the very machinery meant to build public infrastructure. They had turned hope into currency and then vanished with it. Jasmine stood up slowly, the wheels already turning. She didn't need to think. She needed to act. With a single swipe, she triggered the secure DOJ line. "This is Crockett," she said, her voice steady as steel. "I want every forensic accountant in the Federal Procurement Fraud Task Force activated now. I want subpoenas ready for all known contractors tied to the California Rail Project. I want a digital trace on every shell company Duffy flagged." There was a pause on the line, then quiet movement. No one questioned her. They knew what it meant when Jasmine gave orders at this hour. "We're opening a full-scale federal investigation," she continued, pacing the room. "And we're not looking for paperwork errors. We're looking for intent." Her final words cut through the line like a scalpel. This wasn't incompetence. This was engineered theft. "We're going to prove it, and we're going to bury them with it." The encrypted transmission arrived just after midnight. Jasmine Crockett had been waiting, still in her office, the glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across stacks of documents and open case files. Her phone buzzed once. "Duffy, upload complete." She tapped the tablet beside her, and the screen lit up with images that made her jaw clench and her heart hammer in her chest. There it was. Rusted scaffolding, half-built bridges, abandoned machinery, and barren land where $33 billion was supposed to live. A silent testimony to the betrayal buried beneath bureaucracy. The footage Duffy captured played without narration. It didn't need one. Every frame screamed corruption. Every second of silence felt louder than sirens. Jasmine's eyes locked on one photo, a rusted steel beam with a torn safety banner sagging beside it. A monument to decay, built not from stone, but from lies. Her mind moved fast. This wasn't just simple fraud. It was something far worse. It was a carefully planned attack on public trust, done slowly over years and disguised as progress. She flipped through the invoices attached to the images. Each one was worse than the last. Huge payments to nameless companies, all with vague job descriptions like site prep or logistics. Some companies had no physical address. Others listed only mailboxes or forwarding services. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a sharp, cold awareness. This was organized theft. They weren't just taking money, they were using the government's own systems to hide it. They took people's hopes, turned them into dollar signs, and disappeared. Jasmine stood up, calm but focused. She didn't need more time. She needed to move. Now with a single swipe, she opened the secure Justice Department line. "This is Crockett," she said, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Activate every forensic accountant in the Federal Procurement Fraud Task Force. I want subpoenas ready for every contractor connected to the California Rail Project. And I want a full digital trace on every fake company Duffy identified." There was silence for a beat, then movement. No one argued. Everyone understood what it meant when Jasmine gave orders in the middle of the night. "We're launching a full federal investigation," she said, walking the room with purpose. "And we're not looking for small mistakes. We're going after the people who planned this." Her last words were cold, clear, and final. This wasn't bad management. This was a well-designed crime. We're going to prove it and take them down for good. What began as a field report from a dusty graveyard in Fresno quickly turned into a financial manhunt, because once the investigation launched, the numbers started talking. And what they said was terrifying. Jasmine stood frozen, eyes locked on the glowing contract matrix stretching across the screen. Each red line represented a transaction. Each node an alias, a company, a bank account. And all of them led back to one name, not buried, not hidden, prominently placed at the center of it all: Gavin Nome. It wasn't just his signature, it was his pattern. The timing of approvals, the routing of payments, the coordination between shell companies. It all moved like clockwork, like design. She felt a chill crawl down her spine as the pieces clicked together in her mind. He hadn't stumbled into this. He had built it. Not a puppet, not a pawn. The engineer of the theft. The man elected to lead the state had written the blueprint for its betrayal. The injustice hit her hard, not just as an officer of the law, but as someone who had fought her way through every level of a system that now looked rigged from the top down. This wasn't just about missing money. It was about stolen futures, broken trust, Communities that never got the schools, hospitals, or jobs they were promised, because one man had siphoned billions behind a curtain of fake progress. Jasmine clenched her fists, jaw tight. She had faced corruption before, but never one this bold, this deliberate, this shameless. Gavin Nome had turned governance into a ghost operation, and for years no one had stopped him. But that was about to change. She turned to her team, her voice low and sharp. We're not just dealing with fraud. We're dealing with a machine and its creator. Hidden behind layers of polished accounting language and bureaucratic jargon were contracts worth hundreds of millions, sent straight to companies that didn't exist. No licenses, no employees, no operating history, just names on paper and routing numbers tied to empty offices and mailbox stores across multiple states. These weren't failed startups or struggling vendors. They were phantoms built to receive, disappear, and never be questioned. The pattern was undeniable. Massive payouts labeled under vague descriptions like site planning, transport logistics, or material staging. Yet no trucks rolled, no blueprints drawn, no materials ever delivered. Jasmine stood over the shoulder of her lead analyst as he pulled up a summary report. The total so far, over $1.7 billion paid out to shell companies with zero verified activity. The blood drained from her face, but her fury burned hotter. Then came the next blow. One analyst cross-checked contract approvals against executive sign-off logs. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we've got a match. 5 major contracts, each over $100 million, all signed by the same person." Jasmine moved fast, leaning over the screen. Her breath caught when she saw it. There it was, Gavin Nome's signature, clean and deliberate, stamped on each agreement like a personal seal. These weren't departmental approvals rubber-stamped by middlemen. These were direct authorizations from the governor's office, rushed through in under 48 hours, skipping every oversight mechanism that should have stopped them. Jasmine stared at the name, her jaw locked. This wasn't passive negligence. This was power being used as a weapon. The same man who stood at press conferences promising innovation had been quietly bleeding the system dry. But the worst was yet to come. One company stood out above the rest, Ceylon Consulting. It had received a staggering $1.2 billion in just 4 months. The analysts tried to verify its operations. No office, no staff, no website. The listed address was a mailbox in a strip mall in rural Texas, wedged between a pawn shop and a payday loan storefront. IRS records showed a single tax filing claiming 0 revenue and 0 employees. Yet the payment trail revealed otherwise. Dozens of federal transfers funneled in, then scattered to offshore accounts in less than 72 hours. Jasmine stared at the screen, her hands frozen above the table. Ceylon wasn't just a shell, it was a black hole, built to eat taxpayer money and vanish without a trace. And Gavin Nome's signature had been on every document tied to it. She had seen enough. Gavin Nome wasn't just a man who got too comfortable with power. He had weaponized it, designed a system that operated in shadows while smiling for the cameras. Jasmine had exposed the bones of the scheme: ghost companies, missing funds, offshore accounts. But what she needed now was leverage. Proof that would silence the doubters, shift public opinion, and break the firewall around him. She didn't have to wait long, because Gavin, true to form, couldn't resist the spotlight. Under fire, under pressure, with headlines swirling and questions mounting, he did what ego always does under threat. It stepped into the light. The hastily arranged press conference was meant to seize control of the narrative, but from the moment Gavin stepped up to the podium, control was already gone. He looked sharp, custom navy suit, crisp white shirt, flag pin on the lapel, but his eyes betrayed the calm he was trying to project. He cleared his throat, leaned into the mic, and began with a slow, practiced tone. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear," he said, scanning the room. "These so-called investigations, they are nothing more than political theater, a stunt, a coordinated attack led by people who are threatened by California's success." His smile was thin, almost forced. "There is no scandal. There is no fraud. We've been audited, reviewed, and cleared time and time again." The words rolled off like campaign sound bites, but the reporters weren't buying it. One stepped forward. Governor, is it true that over $1.2 billion was paid to a company with no physical office, no employees, and no project records? Gavin's jaw tightened. His tongue ran across his teeth before he replied. Silan Consulting is one of many vendors used in our fast-track development program, he said. We delegate. We move fast. That's how progress works. Another voice shouted, but that company is registered to a mailbox in Texas. A flicker of hesitation, a flash of something in his eyes, uncertainty, fear, or worse, recognition. He shifted his weight, adjusted his tie, and continued, a bit more clipped. This isn't about facts. This is about politics, about people like Jasmine Crockett, who'd rather chase headlines than build infrastructure. She's not helping the country. She's playing games. Back in D.C., Jasmine stood in the war room, surrounded by her team, eyes locked on the live feed. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She watched Gavin unravel one sentence at a time. The lighting on his forehead betrayed the sweat his team tried to blot away. His rehearsed calm started to crack. The crowd of reporters was relentless now. Governor, did you personally sign off on those payments? Do you deny your name appears on 5 high-value contracts? Can you explain why there's no oversight record on those disbursements? With each question, his confidence chipped away. And then, it happened. One reporter, calm but surgical, delivered the final cut. Governor, where did the money go? Gavin froze. Just for a second, but it was enough. The corner of his eye twitched. His lips parted. His pupils widened. A single bead of sweat rolled down his cheek. The silence in the room stretched just 1 second too long. And in that second, he told the truth without saying a word. Jasmine grabbed the remote and hit pause. The screen froze on his face, half defensive, half exposed. A mask slipping. The illusion of control shattered. She stepped forward slowly, as if staring down a target. Her voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through concrete. That's not the face of a man being framed, she said. That's the face of a man who knows we found the bodies. The team around her said nothing. They didn't need to. Everyone felt it. The shift. The power dynamic had changed. Gavin Nome had gone from predator to prey, and he did it to himself. Jasmine turned toward her senior legal officer. I want subpoenas on every individual tied to those contracts, senior staff, intermediaries, corporate officers. And I want warrants drafted for the project's finance records. Every version, every redacted audit, every internal memo. Then she paused, eyes returning to the frozen screen. Make sure they know, she said, voice like cold iron. The press conference was his warning shot. Ours is incoming. This time it's not a microphone. It's federal law. In that moment, the war room exploded into action. Phones lit up. Subpoenas were prepared. Files were unlocked. Jasmine watched Gavin's image on the screen for one last moment. The sweat, the eyes, the lies. She leaned in and whispered under her breath, not for the cameras, not for the public, but for him. You just gave yourself away, Governor. And now, we take everything back. Gavin Nome's face had betrayed him, but it was the subpoenas that broke the dam. Jasmine's voice had barely faded from the war room when the first batch went out. 30 envelopes, sealed and stamped, hand-delivered before sunrise. They didn't go to low-level staffers or distant subcontractors. They went to the heart of the machine, senior transportation officials, financial officers, campaign consultants, appointed heads of state agencies, and political donors with direct ties to billion-dollar rail contracts. No one was untouchable now. Each subpoena landed like a thunderclap, cracking the shield of silence that had protected Nome's empire for over a decade. Jasmine didn't want whispers. She wanted collapses, and within hours they started. By noon, a deputy counsel from the California Department of Infrastructure called DOJ's Secure Line, voice low but urgent. I don't want to go down for this, he said. If I talk, can I stay out of prison? Before the team could even respond, another call came in, this time from a partner at a private firm that had received over $200 million in logistics support payments. His lawyer made the ask bluntly, full cooperation for limited immunity. Jasmine's legal team moved fast. Conditional deals were drawn, interview rooms prepared, statements taken, and what they got was more than confirmation. It was architecture. One whistleblower shared internal memos instructing staff to avoid digital communication. Another revealed off-record meetings held at private residences, where Gavin personally approved massive payments for acceleration purposes. The fraud wasn't sloppy, it was choreographed. And outside the DOJ, the political collapse had begun. Inside Gavin Nome's inner circle, fear turned into abandonment. His chief of staff resigned quietly, slipping out a side door. The campaign finance director, who had once boasted about innovative donor channels, deleted her LinkedIn account and left town. Public relations teams walked away from their contracts. Even his most loyal fundraiser, billionaire tech CEO who'd once hosted Gavin in Napa for a $10,000 a plate dinner, announced that all donations were suspended until further notice. Events vanished from the governor's website. His 2030 Senate ambitions, once an open secret, were now a closed joke. He was bleeding influence, and Jasmine had only just started turning the knife. Jasmine sat in front of the master case board, eyes scanning the now color-coded web. Red for hostile, yellow for cooperative, blue for unknown. And as the red pins turned yellow, she saw what had been hiding in plain sight. This wasn't just a money grab. It was a political pipeline. Public funds had been laundered through shell corporations, then recirculated as donations to Nome-aligned PACs. Infrastructure projects were fake, but the influence they bought, very real. Legislative favors, election endorsements, appointments, it had all been paid for with taxpayer money disguised as development. Jasmine leaned forward, the room silent around her. "This isn't about railroads anymore," she said. "This is about power. This is a coordinated, multi-agency, multi-donor political operation masquerading as public service." Her team stood still, processing the weight of it. "And now that we've broken the silence," she continued, voice low but electric, "we're going to take down every piece of it." The subpoenas were just the beginning. Next came seizures, bank records, digital audits. Jasmine had crossed the line from investigator to counter-operator, and the deeper she pushed, the clearer it became. Nome hadn't just stolen money. He had hijacked the machinery of democracy. This was bigger than California, bigger than high-speed rail. And every day that passed, more insiders flipped, more phones rang, and more emails arrived marked, willing to testify. The breakthroughs had been coming fast, but this one didn't come with a dramatic phone call or a knock at midnight. It came in silence. It was 2:13 a.m. in the DOJ's Cyber Financial Intelligence Division when a junior analyst named Ethan Cole leaned forward, squinting at a blinking terminal. He'd been tracking a maze of offshore transactions for weeks, hundreds of flagged payments routed through impossible webs of shell companies, trusts, and blind accounts. Most dead-ended, some looped back. But this thread, this one was different. The timing, the routing, the amounts. It was too clean, too perfect. Then the final node lit up, a political campaign trust based in the Cayman Islands, masked by multiple cutouts but tied unmistakably to Gavin Nome's re-election committee. Ethan didn't say a word. He stood, walked directly to his supervisor, and handed over the trace log. Within 15 minutes, Jasmine Crockett was in a secure briefing room, staring at a digital map that looked like a spider web strung across the globe. 12 shell companies, all fake. Each one designed to receive large wire transfers, some from federal infrastructure budgets, others from state grants, then dissolve. Gone. No employees, no payroll, no office furniture, no signs of life. Just transactions. Ghost money. Flowing in, flowing out, and finally converging into a single offshore vault. The figure was staggering. $2.4 billion. Not theoretical, not mismanaged, moved, hidden, and now found. Jasmine didn't blink. She read every line. Payment memos like materials prep, phase 2, or environmental mitigation allocation, hiding theft under the language of bureaucracy. But it was the final account, untitled, faceless, but linked to a digital wallet used by Nome's campaign, that made her blood go cold. This wasn't poor oversight. This wasn't even high-level fraud. This was strategic, systemic, and aimed directly at the heart of democracy. He had stolen public funds and transformed them into political capital. The taxpayers thought they were funding trains. In reality, they had funded a war chest, a machine designed not to build, but to consolidate power. She turned to the assembled prosecutors and forensic officers. The room was dead silent, the kind of silence that comes just before a gunshot. "We're done asking questions," Jasmine said, her voice steady, low, and final. "This isn't oversight. It's organized criminal theft of federal funds, laundered through state contracts, and used to illegally fund a political campaign." She walked to the center of the room, clicking through the projected evidence. "Start asset freeze protocols. File foreign cooperation requests with the Caymans. I want that campaign trust locked down before sunrise." Her tone shifted. "Issue arrest warrants for any executive officer tied to these entities. Priority target, Gavin Nome." A prosecutor near the door whispered, "Are we escalating to federal indictment?" Jasmine turned slowly, her expression carved from granite. "We're not escalating," she said. "We're detonating. Gavin Nome didn't just rig a budget, he rigged the state." Chaos followed, controlled chaos. Phones lit up, encryption keys activated. A wall of redacted filings and contract metadata was unlocked and synced to the federal criminal database. Jasmine moved like a commander mid-battle, not needing to shout, every instruction sharp and surgical. Agents began drafting DOJ indictments, even as others contacted the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to start freezing accounts. They had him, finally. After months of chasing shadows, buried trails, and legal dead ends, they had the pressure point. Not an opinion, not a theory, a number, a dollar amount, a direct link, a crime that spoke for itself. And in the center of it all, as the government machine roared into motion behind her, Jasmine stood still, one hand on the glowing digital screen where Gavin Nome's name now sat above a figure in red, $2,417,600,000. She stared at it for a long moment, then said, softly but with the force of law behind every syllable, "This isn't an investigation anymore. This is a criminal prosecution, and he's not walking away from this one." At exactly 5:42 a.m., Sacramento's quiet was broken by the low hum of blacked-out Suburbans sweeping down Capitol Avenue in formation. Street cameras were disabled. Local police had been instructed to stand down. This wasn't optics. It was federal execution. The lead SUV rolled to a stop in front of the west wing of the California State Capitol, and before the engine cut, the first team of FBI agents were already on the move. They wore dark jackets stamped in bold yellow, Public Corruption Task Force. There were no warning shots, no polite announcements, only the sound of heavy boots on stone and the thud of palm against glass as they swept past the receptionist and straight toward the governor's executive suite. Inside, the staff barely had time to rise from their desks. One screamed. Another tried to lock a drawer. It was too late. "Search warrant! Step back!" one agent barked, voice crisp and legal. Dozens of agents fanned out, each assigned to a precise location: Gavin Nome's private office, his policy research team, the finance coordinator's server room. Every cabinet was opened. Safes were cracked. Thumb drives were bagged. A shredder still warm from recent use was photographed, seized, and tagged. It didn't matter how ornate the furnishings were, how historic the walls felt. This was no longer the seat of power. It was a crime scene. In Gavin Nome's office, agents opened his polished oak desk to find encrypted hard drives, donor briefing folders marked eyes only, and printed financial summaries with handwritten notes in the governor's distinctive black ink. One agent leaned over and whispered into his comm, "We've got original authorizations. Director, no filters." The team moved methodically, stacking evidence boxes, snapping photos of walls lined with campaign memorabilia, now under federal lock. Out in the hallway, a staffer sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming silently down her face. She had worked here for 8 years. She had believed in this man, and now all around her, everything was falling apart. But the Capitol wasn't the only battlefield. 7 minutes after the Capitol breach, a second convoy of agents hit Nome's campaign headquarters. The office, once bustling with interns and thick with the hum of espresso machines and idealism, was now dead silent, save for the sound of latex gloves snapping and evidence scanners beeping. Agents moved through donor databases, confiscated burner phones, and unplugged every terminal connected to campaign finance. One wall-sized whiteboard read, "Next fundraiser, Bay Area, $10,000 per plate." In a secure DOJ facility 2,700 miles away, Jasmine Crockett stood before a massive wall of screens, each one a live feed from the raids. Her arms were crossed, eyes locked, face stone still. She didn't blink as she watched Nome's empire fold in on itself. She saw agents carry out boxes labeled private contributions, discretionary, saw Nome's executive assistant escorted out in tears, saw campaign volunteers sitting against the wall, heads down, whispering to each other in disbelief. Jasmine leaned slightly forward as the FBI cracked into a locked cabinet and pulled out a folder marked Contingency Plan, Cayman. Her jaw tightened. That was the proof of intent. That was premeditation, the quiet kind of evil, the well-dressed kind. This wasn't theater. It wasn't partisan revenge. This was the law finding its way through the smoke. Jasmine's voice broke the silence like a verdict. "Get the forensic accountants into the field," she said. "I want real-time tracking on every wire transfer in and out of his known networks. If there's still money moving, we choke it." Around her, her team burst into motion. Phones lit up. Cyber teams connected with financial crimes units. Airspace was secured over the Capitol. Every movement was documented. Every asset was targeted. And as the raid reached its second hour, a junior agent found a handwritten note tucked into the drawer beneath Gavin Nome's desk. It wasn't addressed. It simply read, "If you're reading this, it means I waited too long." The press room inside the state capitol had never felt colder. The air was heavy, not from temperature, but from something unspoken. That eerie stillness before a ship finally sinks. Outside, helicopters circled like vultures. Inside, cameras were lined shoulder to shoulder, blinking red like 100 unblinking eyes. Reporters filled every inch of the room, their faces grim, their questions locked and loaded. No one was here for policy. No one was here for spin. They were here for the fall. And then he appeared. Gavin Nome stepped out from behind the curtain, not with the confidence of a sitting governor, but with the mechanical gait of a man carrying the weight of his own undoing. The podium seemed taller than usual, the spotlight harsher. His tailored suit clung to him like armor, but his face told a different story. Ashen, thinner than before, the spark in his eyes now dimmed by weeks of collapse and betrayal. He cleared his throat, adjusted the mic with a hand that barely stopped shaking, and began. "Good evening," he said, tone low and rehearsed. "Today I come before you not as a politician, but as a man who has always placed California first." A pause, a flicker of hesitation. "I have spent the last decade fighting for innovation, infrastructure, and inclusion. We've rebuilt schools, funded clean energy, and modernized transportation. But in recent weeks, a wave of politically motivated accusations has cast a shadow over this administration's work. As such, effective immediately, I am resigning as governor of California." The room didn't erupt. It didn't even move. It froze. For a few seconds, there was no reaction at all, just the quiet exhale of something inevitable. The bomb had dropped, but the shock was still setting in. But Gavin wasn't finished. "I want to be very clear," he continued, voice tightening. "I am innocent. I have done nothing wrong. The narrative being spun by the Department of Justice is not rooted in truth. It is rooted in vengeance. This is a federal overreach, a witch hunt, a coordinated effort to dismantle what we've built simply because we refuse to play by Washington's rules." He tried to hold eye contact with the press, but his gaze faltered, darting just slightly left, then down, then back. His hand brushed nervously against the side of the podium, fingertips tapping wood in a rhythm no one else could hear. "They call this justice," he said, "but what I see is ambition disguised as law. I see people like Jasmine Crockett, weaponizing the system to climb higher while dragging good leaders down." His voice cracked, not from emotion but from pressure, from the slow-motion implosion of a career built on charisma, now being crushed under subpoenas and offshore wire transfers. This resignation is not an admission of guilt, he said. It is an act of sacrifice. I refuse to let California's government be paralyzed by a spectacle. But the spectacle had already begun. A reporter stood. Governor, will you be indicted? Another. Is it true your campaign account in the Cayman Islands received federal funds? A third. How many staffers have flipped on you? Gavin flinched. His lips parted. No words came. He tightened his jaw and leaned back toward the mic. I won't answer to media trials. That's not justice. That's political theater. The room buzzed, not with applause, but with quiet disbelief. There was no standing ovation, no family at his side, no final moment of dignity, only flashing cameras, blurred whispers, and a long walk back behind the curtain where no one waited. He exited not to cheers, but to silence. A legacy crumbling not because of an enemy, but because of truth. And as the door shut behind him, the questions kept echoing. But Gavin Nome would not answer them, because now the law would. While Gavin Nome stepped away from the podium into the shadows of disgrace, halfway across the country, Jasmine Crockett stepped into the light with the full force of the law behind her. The briefing room at the Department of Justice was packed to the walls. Reporters murmured beneath the buzz of overhead lights. Cameras pointed squarely at the black DOJ seal, hanging like a final judgment behind the podium. Then the room fell silent, not by command, but by presence. Jasmine Crockett stepped to the microphone, a folder in one hand, her posture razor straight, her expression carved from stone. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't smile. She opened the folder, laid it on the podium, and spoke. Not as a politician, not even as an attorney, but as the voice of a system long denied its teeth. Today, she began, her voice cool and steady, the Department of Justice is unsealing a criminal indictment against former Governor Gavin Nome, as well as multiple co-conspirators tied to the California high-speed rail project. The words landed like hammers, each one louder than the last. The charges include large-scale financial fraud, misappropriation of federal infrastructure funding, and conspiracy to launder billions through domestic and international shell corporations. No one breathed. Flashbulbs popped. Jasmine continued, her tone unwavering. Our evidence shows a coordinated scheme, engineered, approved, and personally authorized by the former governor to siphon public money into private political capital. She paused, not for effect, but because the gravity of what followed required space. Let me be absolutely clear. This was not a clerical error. This was not poor management. This was theft of taxpayer dollars, of public trust, and of democratic integrity. She flipped a page. We have secured digital logs, encrypted communications, financial records, and sworn testimony from multiple cooperating witnesses. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Every transfer, every forged audit, every offshore account, they all lead back to the same office. She didn't need to name him again. The room already knew. This is not about politics. This is about criminal accountability, and the law will be applied with the full force it was written to carry. Reporters erupted with questions. Jasmine didn't flinch. She looked up, met their eyes, and said calmly, "Justice is not a press cycle. It's a process, and today that process has begun." The storm didn't wait for permission. Within hours of Jasmine Crockett's DOJ announcement, the media landscape shifted from coverage to collapse. Networks broke into regular programming with red banners flashing across screens. Breaking DOJ charges former Governor Gavin Nome in $2.4 billion federal fraud scheme. The term spread fast. Railgate. First, it appeared in a single tweet from a political journalist in Sacramento. Then it was repeated on MSNBC. By midday, it was splashed across the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times in bold black letters. Railgate, a crisis of corruption. In a matter of hours, it became the dominant political headline across the country. But this wasn't just a story. It was an autopsy. And California was the body on the table. Every channel had its own version. CNN aired drone footage of FBI agents seizing evidence boxes marked Governor's Office, Finance. Fox News labeled it a blueprint for criminal governance. Social media was on fire. Hashtags like Joshua Railgate, Joshaka Where is the Money, and Joshua Nome Fall trended globally. Memes surfaced within minutes. Nome's mugshot photoshopped onto fake campaign posters, or signs that once read high-speed future, now edited to say high-speed theft. But underneath the internet humor, there was a deep, unsettling rage taking root. People weren't laughing because it was funny. They were laughing because they felt betrayed, and they were furious. Investigative podcasts launched overnight, combing through old speeches, budget proposals, and donor records. One popular clip showed Gavin Nome, just 3 years earlier, promising that California's high-speed rail will be the gold standard for 21st century infrastructure. Now, that same quote was overlaid with images of rusted rebar and dirt lots, empty construction sites, and signs reading, Future Rail Line, Est, Ison Sibsilnion. The betrayal wasn't abstract. It was visible, tangible, and decades in the making. Civil engineers who had once praised the project now gave interviews describing fake blueprints, missing permits, and sudden funding shifts they were told not to question. Whistleblowers surfaced from all angles. Former interns, state contractors, even city officials who'd raised concerns and been told to let it go. And in the center of it all was Jasmine. She didn't chase the spotlight. She didn't sit for interviews or write op-eds. But her face was everywhere, standing at the podium in the DOJ press room, backlit by the American flag, stating in precise legal terms that power had limits. Talk shows dissected her every word. Editorials called her the new face of federal accountability. Conservative hosts tried to paint her as a partisan figure, until her legal filings were released in full, line by line, with evidence so overwhelming that even skeptics stopped talking and started reading. California's political ecosystem imploded overnight. Lawmakers once seen as untouchable began scrubbing their websites. Several members of the state legislature who had endorsed the rail funding now found themselves under audit. A handful deleted old tweets praising Nome's visionary leadership, while others simply went dark. Governors in other states were forced to respond as constituents demanded transparency on their own infrastructure projects. What began as a California scandal was becoming a national reckoning, and still the name stuck. Railgate. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a symbol of how deeply systems could be corrupted under the illusion of progress. A symbol of what happens when ambition metastasizes into greed. But most of all, it became a turning point. A moment when ordinary Americans stopped trusting the promises of polished men in tailored suits and started asking a new question. Who's really holding the blueprint? As the world digested the scale of Railgate, one final chapter remained unwritten. The sentencing of the man who had started it all. Cameras couldn't follow him into federal court. The headlines could only speculate. But inside that granite-walled chamber, far from microphones and campaign rallies, Gavin Nome would finally have to face what he'd spent years outrunning: accountability. It was the most high-profile sentencing in California's modern history. The courtroom brimmed with a silent storm. Federal agents, journalists, families of whistleblowers, even former staffers who once believed in him, but now sat behind barricades of disbelief. Gavin Nome, the former golden boy of coastal politics, entered wearing a plain gray suit and a federal-issued expression. No tie, no smile, no more illusions of control. His hands were cuffed, ankles chained, the echo of every step a reminder of how far he had fallen. Behind him, 2 federal marshals. In front of him, the judge who had presided over 6 weeks of damning testimony and forensic evidence too intricate and too devastating to deny. The court clerk read the charges aloud, and the list seemed to stretch on forever. Wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, embezzlement, abuse of federal authority, manipulation of campaign finance through offshore trusts. One by one, each charge was answered with a single word from the jury: guilty. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was gravity, like the breath before a landslide. Everyone knew what was coming, but not how it would land. Judge Elena Cross adjusted her glasses, looked directly at Gavin Nome, and began her sentence. Not from a script, but from memory. Mr. Nome, she said, voice measured but laced with iron, you did not simply commit fraud. You orchestrated an ecosystem of theft. You stole from taxpayers. You stole from the poor. You stole from the future under the guise of progress. She leaned forward slightly. You weaponized power with surgical precision and wrapped it in the language of leadership. That makes you not only a criminal, but a coward. She continued, unwavering. You turned hope into currency, and today that currency has expired. A beat. You are hereby sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. You will serve no less than 20 years before being eligible for parole. Murmurs rose, then fell. Furthermore, the court orders the immediate forfeiture of all assets linked to your fraudulent activity, totaling more than $300 million, including international holdings and illicit campaign funds in the Cayman Islands. She paused one last time. You are permanently barred from holding any public office within the United States. Your political career ends here, and it ends not in applause, but in accountability. Gavin didn't speak. His lawyer remained stone-faced. And as the judge's gavel fell with a final crack that echoed like a gunshot, the moment turned from history into consequence. The man who once promised to redefine California's future would now spend his own behind bars, stripped of title, wealth, and legacy. Two marshals stepped forward and tightened the chains around his wrists. He was led through a side door. No press, no farewell, no second chance. Behind him, the courtroom didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply watched him vanish, one step at a time, into the system he had once believed couldn't touch him. Jasmine Crockett stood alone in her office. The lights dimmed, the city outside blurred through the rain-slicked windows. The press had gone quiet. The courtroom was empty. Gavin Nome was on his way to a maximum security federal prison in Colorado, but Jasmine wasn't celebrating. There were no champagne corks, no victory speeches, just the echo of silence and the weight of everything it had taken to get here. She stared at the digital caseboard on the wall, now stripped of photos, red string, and names. It was blank, finished, but her mind was not. The cost of truth was never just political, it was personal. She had lost sleep, trust, and friends in the firestorm. She had been threatened, dismissed, accused of grandstanding, and yet she'd stood not for power, but for principle. She walked slowly to her desk and ran her fingers along the edge, remembering every late night, every closed-door briefing, every witness who almost backed out. She thought of the first photo Duffy had sent, those rusted beams in the California sun, surrounded by nothing but dust and silence. That was the moment she knew something was wrong. And this moment was when the lie finally died. Her phone buzzed with reporters, congratulatory texts, political operatives hungry to make her the face of the next fight. She let it ring. She didn't need the spotlight. She didn't need a stage. She looked at the ceiling, exhaled, and whispered not to anyone else, but to herself. We didn't win. We corrected the record. And sometimes that has to be enough. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the courtroom lights dimmed, America did what it always does after scandal. It searched for comparisons. Pundits debated on cable news, professors drafted op-eds, and historians reached for familiar names like lifelines. Watergate, Enron, and now Railgate. The comparisons were inevitable, but they weren't hollow. Each scandal had its own architecture, but they were all born from the same blueprint: secrecy, power, and a belief that no one was watching. Watergate had its tapes. Enron had its fake balance sheets. Railgate had hollow steel and fake companies propped up by forged contracts and campaign smoke. But what made Railgate different, what made it feel bigger, was the scope. This wasn't just political. It wasn't just financial. It was systemic, and it was personal. In Watergate, the public watched Nixon resign in disgrace after a handful of reporters cracked open a conspiracy that reached the highest office in the land. In Enron, they watched a corporation collapse like a rotted tree, bringing thousands of pensions and lives down with it. But Railgate was something more intimate. It was a betrayal built into sidewalks and broken promises. Californians drove past rusted scaffolding every day, believing progress was coming, that a future was being built beneath the silence. Instead, they were driving past the crime scene. Instead of progress, there was theft. Instead of jobs, there were offshore accounts. And no one, not one agency, not one watchdog, not one voter, was told the truth. And that's why it hit harder, because this wasn't a secret operation behind closed doors. It was a theft performed in daylight, hidden in plain sight, disguised with the language of public good. The money was federal, but the damage was local. Communities promised jobs that never came. Cities left with empty lots. Families paying taxes into a project that had become a political money laundering scheme. Gavin Nome didn't just steal funds. He stole time, years of hope, decades of trust. And that's what made the justice feel not just necessary, but historic. As journalists repeated Jasmine Crockett's final indictment line, this wasn't incompetence, it was engineered theft. The words echoed far beyond one courtroom. They became etched into public memory like, "I am not a crook," or "mark-to-market accounting." The lesson wasn't just legal, it was moral. Every empire built in the shadows eventually stands in the light. And the bigger the lie, the louder the silence before it explodes. So they called it Railgate, and rightly so. A scandal not just of fraud, but of faith lost. And across the country, governors, mayors, and campaign donors watched nervously, realizing Jasmine Crockett hadn't just ended one man's career. She'd redrawn the map of what happens when the truth is buried under concrete. Let me know if you'd like the final epilogue scene. Jasmine walking away from politics, or the public beginning to rebuild trust after the reckoning. In the months after Railgate detonated across the country, while analysts dissected subpoenas and politicians scrambled for cover, one truth refused to fade. Jasmine Crockett had changed the rules, not by shouting, not by trending, but by standing alone against a storm most people couldn't even name and refusing to blink. She had walked into a war zone dressed like a lawyer and walked out with a collapsed empire behind her. And she hadn't done it with the approval of party elders, or with the protection of donors, or even the support of many in her own department. She did it knowing she might lose everything, her job, her credibility, her safety, and did it anyway. She represented a new kind of leadership, forged not in press rooms, but in battlefields of bureaucracy. A generation raised on lies dressed as policy, on systems that told them to wait their turn while the rot got deeper. And she didn't wait. She went straight to the heart of it, stared it down, and tore it apart piece by piece. Not for applause, not for ambition, but because someone had to. Because when no one else moves, someone has to burn the path. Jasmine became that someone, and in doing so, she broke the myth that the system cannot be confronted unless you're willing to be exiled. She confronted it and made it yield. The most powerful thing wasn't that she won, it was how she won. She didn't compromise the facts. She didn't settle for half measures. She stood in front of cameras and courts alike and said exactly what she meant. This isn't just a paper trail, it's a blueprint for betrayal, and it ends today. It wasn't rhetoric, it was declaration, and it echoed beyond California. In state houses, campaign offices, and conference calls from D.C. to Tallahassee, her name became shorthand for danger, for what happens when someone comes along who isn't playing to survive, but to dismantle the lie. She wasn't naive. She knew the machine would keep running, that another Gavin would rise one day, cloaked in a different suit, selling the same promises. But she also knew something had cracked. And once cracked, the system would never be able to tell the same story again. Young staffers started whispering her name in meetings. Law students quoted her opening statement in closing arguments. Activists in forgotten counties pinned her picture next to campaign signs, not because she asked to lead, but because she proved what it looked like when someone actually did. Jasmine Crockett didn't just hold Gavin Nome accountable. She reminded a country grown numb to corruption that the law still matters, and that truth, when spoken clearly and without fear, can still bring kings to their knees. Power doesn't collapse with a bang. It erodes, grain by grain, lie by lie, until the man who built his empire with golden promises finds himself sitting in a concrete box, wondering when exactly the rot began. Gavin Nome used to command attention just by walking into a room. Governors deferred to him, Billionaires returned his calls. He spoke with the cadence of inevitability, a man so sure of his own future that it was hard not to believe him. For years, he sold a story of transformation, innovation, progress. He wasn't just building a high-speed rail network. He was building the future, brick by political brick. Cameras followed, donors poured money in, the people applauded. But behind the curtain, that future was quietly rerouted. Not toward the people, but toward himself. He believed the system would protect him, because he had become the system. He had placed the right people in the right rooms, rewired oversight into ritual, and buried paper trails beneath ceremony. And for a while it worked. The money flowed. The question stopped. Power didn't just shield him, it obeyed him. But the thing about power is this: if it stops serving the people, it starts feeding itself, and eventually it devours the one who wields it. By the time Jasmine Crockett entered the scene, Gavin's machine was running on borrowed time. She didn't come with fireworks or headlines. She came with silence and certainty. While others hesitated, she sharpened facts like blades. She watched. She followed. She listened to the parts of reports no one else read. She wasn't chasing clout. She was chasing the lie, the exact moment when leadership turned into theft. And once she found it, she pulled, and everything unraveled. But this story isn't about Gavin's fall. It's about what that fall reveals. That power, unchecked, isn't freedom. It's a slow-building prison made of privilege and denial. Every time he approved a payment to a shell company, every time he signed off on another donor loop, every time he buried a whistleblower's warning, he wasn't protecting himself. He was building the cell that would one day close around him. The same power he used to crush oversight became the evidence that crushed him. The signatures, the wire transfers, the off-the-books campaign meetings in foreign jurisdictions. The illusion of control was never real. It just took time for the walls to show. In the courtroom, the chains were literal, but the true shackles were years in the making. When the judge read the sentence, 30 years, no parole for the first 20, Nome didn't cry. He didn't speak, but his silence was deafening. Because what do you say when the truth you buried has clawed its way out of the ground and wrapped itself around your legacy? What defense remains when the system you rigged decides it's no longer yours to command? This is where the lie breaks. You see, for men like Gavin, power starts as a tool, then becomes a mirror. It reflects what you want to see: respect, admiration, victory. But the mirror lies. It shows the crown, not the cost. And so they forget. They forget that the people they silence remember. That paper trails don't burn as easily as reputations. That even the loudest applause can't drown out the sound of chains dragging behind every dirty deal. Jasmine knew this. She had no illusions about the system. She didn't believe that one arrest could fix decades of institutional rot. But she believed in truth. Not the kind on campaign posters, the kind you dig out of closed-door meetings and encrypted messages, the kind that doesn't glitter, the kind that bleeds. And in bringing Gavin Nome to justice, she didn't just convict a man. She convicted an idea, the idea that ambition without restraint could masquerade as leadership. That public money could be siphoned into private dreams without consequence. That accountability was a myth that only applied to the powerless. Jasmine shattered that idea with every indictment, every witness protected, every offshore account exposed. She didn't just hold the line, she redrew it. But even then, she wasn't celebrating, because she understood what most people don't, that real justice never feels clean. It feels heavy, complicated, lonely. You don't cheer when the verdict comes down. You breathe. You sit with the weight of everything that had to break before the truth could rise. And still, the lesson remains, etched into headlines, case law, and public memory. When power is used to serve the self instead of the people, it becomes its own cage. We've seen it before. Nixon, Skilling, Blagojevich. Every time the warning was the same. Every time someone thought they were different, smarter, Teflon, they weren't. Because the system may be slow, it may be blind, but it's not deaf. It hears the lie long before the liar is ready to fall. And it waits. The tragedy of men like Gavin Nome is not that they were caught. It's that they believed they never could be. They believed that charisma could cover corruption. that ambition could outrun consequence, that the people would never notice the difference between boldness and theft. They were wrong. Railgate didn't just take down a governor, it rewired the conversation. It reminded America that no title is too high, no office too sacred, no legacy too protected to escape the weight of the law. That silence, when weaponized, always collapses under the pressure of truth. And that the higher you climb using public trust as your ladder, the harder you fall when that trust turns to rage. It will happen again. Someone else will rise. They always do. Another smile, another plan, another promise wrapped in gold. But now there is precedent, there is footage, there is Jasmine, and there is the understanding that if you use power to build walls between yourself and the people, those walls don't protect you, they bury you. Power in its purest form is a contract. It is not given, it is loaned. And like all loans, it comes with terms. Use it to uplift others, and you extend the contract. Abuse it, and the contract cancels itself. Sometimes in headlines, sometimes in courtrooms, sometimes in the quiet humiliation of a man being led down a hallway in handcuffs. So let Railgate be remembered not just as a scandal, but as a parable. Not just about one man's fall, but about how systems bend until someone forces them to snap back into place. About how justice can still walk quietly, wearing no cape, carrying only a folder full of facts and a will that does not break. And let Jasmine Crockett's name serve not as a warning to the next leader, but as a reminder. You do not need to be liked to be right. You do not need power to hold it accountable. You only need courage, clarity, and the willingness to go alone, if that's what it takes. Because when power is used to serve the self, it builds a kingdom of glass, and sooner or later, someone throws the stone. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Just seconds before he was shot, Malik Turner raised his hands and said, "I don't have a weapon." But that truth had been buried, quietly, deliberately, until Jasmine Crockett stood up and exposed everything. She was the black attorney the system never expected to fight back. Why did they choose Jasmine for this case? And what truth did she force America to finally confront? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. They say this is a hopeless case, but I didn't come here to hope. I came here to do what's right. Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, sharp and unshaken. Her words echoed off the oak-paneled walls and drew the eyes of every reporter, every juror, every silent doubter in the room. She stood alone at the plaintiff's table, her posture unyielding, her gaze fixed. Behind her, the gallery was packed with city officials, activists, and quiet onlookers, each waiting to see if justice would finally dare to breathe. The tension pressed against the windows like a storm refusing to stay outside. In the front row, a single wooden chair sat empty, a silent monument to Malik Turner, the man whose name filled court documents but whose body lay in the ground, unjustly taken. His wife sat next to the chair, clinging to the hand of their 4-year-old daughter, who played quietly with a pink shoelace. Behind them, Malik's mother bowed her head, gripping an old rosary, her lips trembling without sound. The air was thick with heat, silence, and doubt, until one voice dared to speak. A man 2 rows behind leaned forward, muttering under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. "They gave her the case 'cause she looks right for the cameras." Jasmine didn't flinch, though she heard every word. She had walked into this courtroom knowing she wasn't chosen for her resume, but for the color of her skin and what it might signal to the press. Yet she stood here anyway, not as a symbol, not as a token, but as a woman who refused to let another Black death be filed away without a fight. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the power struggle had already begun. The defense team whispered to one another, smug and settled in their chairs like they'd already won. Jasmine remained silent now, scanning the room. The cameras were rolling, the vultures were watching, and still that empty chair sat unmoved, its silence louder than any objection. The courtroom doors creaked open as Judge Raymond Wallace entered, his black robe sweeping behind him like a shadow. He walked with the ease of a man who'd ruled from that bench for decades, and with the cold detachment of someone who no longer saw people, just case numbers and skin tones. "All rise," the bailiff called. Everyone stood, not in respect, but in quiet resignation. Wallace didn't look at the grieving family. He barely acknowledged Jasmine. His eyes found the defense table first, offering a subtle nod that said everything. This was the judge who routinely sided with police, who dismissed civil rights cases like clearing paperwork. His bias wasn't whispered, it was institutional. Jasmine stood still, jaw clenched. She already knew justice wouldn't come easy in a courtroom where the judge had chosen his side before hearing a word. Wallace sat down, adjusted his robe, and without even lifting his eyes, muttered, "Let's get this over with." The words hit Jasmine like a slap across the face. Get this over with? A man was dead, a child was fatherless, a system had failed, and he treated it like an item on a to-do list. The defense smirked, emboldened by the signal from the bench. Jasmine flipped open her folder, but her fingers paused. For 1 second, she remembered what someone told her once. "You'll never win in his courtroom unless you play by his rules." But Jasmine wasn't here to play. She wasn't here to fit into a system designed to erase men like Malik Turner and women like her. As the court reporter began typing and the first witness was called, Jasmine steadied herself, not because she expected fairness, but because she had decided to fight for it anyway. Jasmine rose from her seat with practiced calm, but her hands were ice cold against the wood of the table. She faced the jury with steady eyes, voice clear and deliberate. "What happened to Malik Turner wasn't a tragic mistake," she began. "It was the predictable result of a system that—" "Ms. Crockett," Judge Wallace cut in sharply, not even looking up from his notes. "Stick to the facts, not the political theater." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jasmine tightened her grip on the lectern but continued. "The facts are that Malik was unarmed, cooperative, and—" "Ms. Crockett," Wallace interrupted again, louder this time. "This is not a rally. Keep your commentary to yourself." Jasmine took a breath, her heartbeat pulsing in her ears. This wasn't just a courtroom, it was a cage, and every time she tried to speak truth, the walls inched closer. But she pressed on, voice unwavering. "What I'm presenting is not commentary, it's evidence. And that evidence—" "One more warning," the judge snapped, slamming his gavel down once, "or you'll be held in contempt." The defense sat back with barely concealed smirks, their silence a smug approval of Wallace's control. Jasmine knew the game being played. Death by interruption. Cut her off enough times, and the jury would lose interest. Discredit her tone, and her argument would feel emotional, not legal. She glanced briefly at Malik's widow, whose eyes pleaded for someone, anyone, to make this court listen. Jasmine's voice dropped, quiet but defiant. "The evidence will show you a man who followed every command and still died with his hands in the air." She didn't look at Wallace. She didn't need to. His contempt was already written in the court transcript, line by line. She had walked into this courtroom to give voice to the voiceless, and she would, whether they let her finish or not. From the moment he stood, the defense attorney, Charles Whitmore, wore the smug confidence of a man who thought the courtroom was already his. His tailored gray suit caught the light, but it was the smirk curling at the edge of his mouth that spoke louder than any opening statement. "Your Honor," he began, glancing sideways at Jasmine, "we do hope this proceeding will focus on the law and not activism." The word hung in the air like poison. He paced slowly, deliberately, addressing the jury as if lecturing a class of schoolchildren. "We understand the plaintiff's counsel is relatively new to high-stakes litigation," he said, emphasizing the word new, with a tone dripping in condescension. "And while passion has its place, it cannot substitute for legal grounding or objectivity." Jasmine didn't flinch, but her jaw set tight. She had heard it before. Coded language cloaked in professionalism. He wasn't just attacking her experience. He was attacking her presence, her legitimacy, her right to stand in that room. Whitmore turned back to the judge. "We simply ask that courtroom decorum be maintained and emotional manipulation be kept to a minimum." The implication was clear. A black woman arguing for a black victim was somehow too emotional to be rational. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine could feel it. The slow erosion of credibility wasn't always loud. It was quiet, tactical, methodical. Whitmore leaned against his table, feigning concern. "This case is about facts, not feelings," he said, casting another sideways glance. "And I'm sure opposing counsel understands the difference." The insult was surgical. Jasmine met his gaze without blinking. She wanted to say something, wanted to fire back. But she knew the trap. React, and they'd say she was unstable. Stay silent, and they'd say she was weak. So she did neither. She stood taller, because sometimes dignity was the sharpest weapon in the room. But the truth was, Whitmore's condescension wasn't new. It was just louder, more public. Jasmine had heard the same thing before, only whispered behind closed doors, coded in civility, but cut from the same blade. She remembered it clearly, the hallway outside courtroom 3B, the smell of old coffee and floor wax clinging to the air. Jasmine had just pinned the case file under her arm when a senior colleague, a man with 2 decades of courtroom swagger and a belt full of courthouse gossip, leaned in with a smirk. "You know why they gave you this one, right?" he whispered, eyes darting to make sure no one else heard. "It's optics. You check a box. You're black. That's all." The words hit her harder than he intended, because he didn't say them to wound. He said them like a fact, like weather, like something settled. Jasmine forced a tight smile, said nothing, and kept walking, but the words clung to her like ash. In his voice, she heard what too many thought but never dared speak, that her education, her training, her tireless hours didn't matter, that in rooms full of suits and secrets, she was seen as a symbol, not a lawyer, that her skin got her through the door, but not the respect. She was there to make them remember. And yet, as the evidence phase began, Jasmine felt something shift. Not dramatically, not like a lightning bolt, but like the quiet tightening of a noose, a slow constriction around her fight for the truth. It began with the video. The dashcam footage from Officer Keene's patrol unit was scheduled to be the prosecution's first nail in the coffin. The undeniable proof that Malik Turner, unarmed and calm, had complied before the bullets came. Jasmine stood as the monitor flickered to life. The room fell silent. On screen, Malik appeared, walking slowly out of his vehicle, his palms facing forward, his shoulders low. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He stopped, turned, and raised his hands. It was all there, except the sound. No voice, no sirens, no warning, no last words. The silence on the recording wasn't accidental. It was surgical. It stripped the moment of urgency, of panic, of intention. It erased the officer's tone, the volume of his command, the space between the question and the trigger pull. Jasmine stared at the screen, her heart thudding. "Your Honor," she said, voice clipped and rising, "the audio is missing. We submitted a discovery request weeks ago for full video files, including audio channels." Judge Wallace didn't even blink. "The visual component is intact. That's enough for the jury." "But the audio," she pressed, "would provide context," he said, cutting her off. "We're not here to guess emotions, Miss Crockett. Stick to what can be seen." The gavel came down once, clean, final, cold. It wasn't just silence. It was strategy. Jasmine sat down, her spine rigid, her pen trembling in her grip. Beside her, Malik's widow turned her face away from the screen, as if unable to bear seeing her husband alive and voiceless at the same time. Then came the police reports, as thick and inconsistent as fog. Officer Keene said Malik lunged. Officer Bowers said he flinched. A third report, unsigned and typed with glaring spelling errors, claimed Malik was holding an unknown black object. An object that had never been recovered, photographed, or even defined. Jasmine stood again, flipping through the printed pages like a prosecutor in a corruption trial. 3 different officers, 3 different versions. No physical evidence, no body cam audio. "And yet these are being presented as fact?" she asked, her voice no longer calm. It was steel under pressure. She held up one report. "This officer states that Malik ignored verbal commands." She turned to the screen. "Which ones?" We don't have the audio. She lifted another. This report says Malik reached for the back of his pants. The video shows both hands visible at all times. Another document. This one refers to a suspect who ran northbound. Malik never moved more than 2 feet. She dropped them onto the table. These are not testimonies. They are contradictions. They don't corroborate. They compete. Wallace adjusted his glasses, exhaled. The court will admit all reports as submitted. Jasmine turned to him, stunned. Even the unsigned one? That's correct. With factual errors? The jury may weigh that accordingly. His voice was bored, like a teacher tired of a student who asked too many questions. The defense leaned back, satisfied, one of them casually scratching his chin with a gold pen. The jurors glanced between themselves, unsure, confused. Jasmine felt it all slipping. The truth, the weight of what had happened, was right there in front of them, but the system wrapped it in procedure and called it objectivity. She sat down slowly, as if her chair had grown sharper edges. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no outrage, just more silence, the kind that tells you the room was never designed to hear you in the first place. She was surrounded by people, but more alone than ever. The facts were there, but filtered through a lens already fogged with bias. She was a voice in a room full of ears that had long since decided what they wanted to hear. And for a moment, just a moment, Jasmine wondered if the truth could survive when the system itself was allergic to it. But even as the judge moved on, even as the defense prepared their next smug objection, she made herself a silent promise. You don't stop when the system gets loud. You get louder. But if the evidence could be bent to fit a narrative, the questions that challenged it were smothered before they ever left her lips. Jasmine didn't just have to argue. She had to fight for permission to speak at all. Jasmine stood, shoulders square, voice steady, ready to cross-examine Officer Keene, the man whose bullet ended Malik Turner's life. The courtroom leaned in as she walked slowly toward the witness stand, heels tapping like a metronome of purpose. Officer Keene, you stated that Mr. Turner was non-compliant. Can you specify what command he failed to obey? She asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Objection! The defense barked before the officer could answer. Compound question. Judge Wallace didn't hesitate. Sustained. Jasmine tried again. Did Mr. Turner ever verbally threaten you? Objection. Argumentative. Sustained. Her jaw clenched. She stepped forward, flipping open the officer's report. You wrote that he reached toward his waistband. Do you recall which hand he used? Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence. This time the judge didn't even look up. Sustained again, Miss Crockett. You're skirting the line. She took a breath, deeper this time, and held up the report with both hands. I'm simply quoting the officer's own statement. Enough, the judge snapped, slamming his gavel once. Move on. The courtroom tensed, as if waiting for her to snap, to break, to prove them right. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened, adjusted her blazer, and looked directly at the jury. Let the record reflect that the witness has not answered a single direct question. There was a flicker, a twitch in one juror's eye, a hint of discomfort, but the rest stayed stone-faced, buried in their notebooks. Jasmine stepped back, her pulse racing. Every time she tried to pierce the narrative, she was silenced, not by evidence but by obstruction disguised as order. This wasn't cross-examination. It was a dance on a minefield, where every step toward truth triggered another explosion from the bench. And yet, even with the decks stacked and the walls closing in, she stayed on her feet, because silence was what they wanted, and she refused to give it to them. Outside the courthouse, the headlines had already chosen their side, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't part of it. News outlets aired footage of the trial in short, carefully edited clips, a tense exchange with the judge, a close-up of Jasmine's stern face mid-question, always cut just before the objection. Trial descends into chaos, one anchor declared. Rookie attorney accused of turning courtroom into protest theater, another headline read. They never mentioned the missing audio. They didn't question the contradictory police reports. They didn't dare say Malik Turner's name without adding the word volatile. Cameras weren't pointed at the defense or the judge who silenced her. They were aimed at Jasmine, dissecting her tone, her expression, her presence. Every moment she spoke truth was twisted into a threat. Every time she fought for fairness, it was repackaged as defiance. She wasn't framed as a lawyer pursuing justice. She was cast as a symbol of disruption and, worse, of disorder. She could feel it inside the courtroom, too. Jurors growing colder, the gallery murmuring louder. Even the way the bailiff looked at her had changed, less procedural, more personal. The air had shifted, not from what she had said, but from how the world had decided to hear it. Wallace, the judge, didn't need to say a word. The narrative had already infected the room like smoke through a vent, and Jasmine, standing alone at the eye of the storm, understood exactly what was happening. They weren't just trying to undermine her case, they were trying to erase her voice, piece by piece, until all that remained was silence they could control. But Jasmine had been underestimated before, and this time the silence wouldn't win. Not while she still had breath. Not while that empty chair in the front row still screamed for justice. She was losing ground, and she could feel it. Every objection sustained, every question cut short, every glance from the judge that said, "Know your place." Jasmine could hear the silent verdict forming long before any jury was asked to speak. Her voice had been trimmed down to sound bites, her logic drowned beneath legal formality. She turned slightly just for a second, needing something, anything to hold on to. That's when she saw her. Malik's daughter, seated beside her mother, no longer fidgeting, no longer twirling her shoelace. The little girl was staring straight at her, eyes wide, not in awe, not in curiosity, but in something deeper, sharper. Fear. It was the kind of fear no child should carry, the fear of watching grown-ups lie and the world pretend it's justice. Jasmine felt it slice through her chest like glass. That look said everything. Don't let them win. She inhaled slowly, the noise of the courtroom falling away, and held her stare just long enough to answer without words. Then she turned back to the bench, spine straight, voice reset, not louder but harder. The judge tapped his pen, bored. The defense whispered behind smirks. But Jasmine was no longer speaking only for the court record. She was speaking for the one person in that room too young to understand injustice, but old enough to feel its weight. As she gathered her notes, her fingers trembled, not from fear but from fury she had learned to master. Beneath her breath, just loud enough for herself to hear, she muttered, "They hired me to stay quiet, but I didn't come here to be silent." And as she stood there alone but unshaken, the room didn't know it yet, but the fight had only just begun. But the courtroom wasn't done trying to shrink her. Just as she gathered the strength to rise again, the next blow came. Not from the bench, but from across the aisle, cloaked in politeness and aimed straight at her worth. The moment had the quiet precision of a blade sliding out of a sheath. No warning, no stumble, just the cold, deliberate cut of words meant to wound. Charles Whitmore stood in the center of the courtroom, with his hands folded in front of him like a priest ready to offer benediction. His tone was gentle, but his eyes gleamed with calculated malice. "Forgive me for asking, counselor," he said, turning toward Jasmine as if he were offering her a courtesy. "But I think it's a fair question for the jury to consider. Were you assigned to this case because of your credentials, or perhaps because of how you'd look standing here?" He let the implication settle like smoke creeping beneath a door. "We all know how public this trial has become. One might wonder whether your presence here was intentionally symbolic." A hushed murmur fluttered across the gallery. One juror blinked, another shifted in their seat, uncertain. The defense table sat smug, lips pressed to hide smirks. Even Judge Wallace didn't intervene. He leaned back. Let it happen. Let the poison do its work. This wasn't just a jab. It was a public attempt to reduce Jasmine to her skin color, to a box ticked by an administration desperate to appease a media storm. To them, she wasn't a lawyer. She was theater, a diversity hire in a tailored blazer. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She didn't flinch or fire back. Instead, she slowly closed the folder in front of her, calmly capped her pen, and stepped out from behind the table. Her heels echoed softly against the tile floor, one deliberate step after another, until she stood directly in the center of the courtroom. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm, but her eyes burned. And when she spoke, the room froze. "You want to know if I was hired because I'm black?" she said, her voice low but unshakably clear. "Yes." The word cracked through the silence like thunder. "I was." She turned to the jury now, her gaze never wavering. "Let's not pretend. They picked me because I fit the photo op, because I made their progress look palatable. A black woman in the courtroom, strong enough to defend, but silent enough not to disrupt. They thought I'd keep my head down, smile politely, ask safe questions, and go home when told." She paused, eyes narrowing. "But what they didn't expect, what none of them expected, was that I see exactly what's happening in this room, and I refuse to look away." She took another step forward. The gallery leaned in without realizing. "I see Breonna Taylor, shot in her sleep, and the system called it a mistake. I see George Floyd, knee on his neck, and the court said, reasonable force. I see Eric Garner, choked to death for selling loose cigarettes, and the response was silence." Her voice rose, sharp and urgent. "And now I see Malik Turner, a man with his hands up, a man who said, 'I don't have a weapon,' a man who was still shot dead, then blamed for it afterward." She turned toward Whitmore now, meeting his eyes with the full force of her fire. "You think I'm here to make this trial look legitimate? You think I'm here because I photograph well?" She shook her head. I'm here because I'm the only one in this room willing to call this what it is, a cover-up dressed as due process." The judge shifted uncomfortably, finally reaching for his gavel, but she wasn't done. She pivoted back to the jury. "This isn't about representation, it's about recognition. The system keeps giving us body bags and calling them accidents. It tells us to stay calm, stay civil, stay quiet. But that quiet is a graveyard. And I didn't come here to dig another hole. I came here to fight for the truth they're trying to bury with legal jargon and redacted files." Her voice dropped to a whisper, tight with control but packed with fury. "So yes, I was hired because I'm black. But I stayed because I'm the only one who still sees Malik as human, and I will not let you turn his death into a footnote just to keep this machine running clean." The courtroom didn't breathe. Jasmine's words hung in the air like a live wire, crackling, dangerous, undeniable. No one moved, not a cough, not a whisper. The judge, who had interrupted her a dozen times before, now sat frozen, eyes narrowed, lips tight. The defense team, usually smug and restless, stared ahead, rigid. And the jury, 12 strangers who had spent the past days avoiding eye contact, now looked directly at her. One woman had tears in her eyes. One man's jaw was clenched. Jasmine hadn't just shaken the room, she had exposed it, laid it bare, called it by name. And for one suspended moment, the machinery of that courtroom stopped turning. But the system doesn't like to be exposed. Judge Wallace cleared his throat, louder than necessary. The sharp crack of his gavel broke the silence. Not to reprimand, not to redirect, but to reclaim control. "Let's proceed," he said, voice clipped, avoiding her eyes. The transcript would record it as a neutral cue, but everyone in that room knew what it was, a warning, the kind you don't have to spell out. The defense shuffled their papers, trying to look unaffected. Reporters glanced at one another, then down at their notes, scribbling furiously to capture what they knew would lead every evening segment. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but the story had already escaped its walls. Jasmine sat down, slow and composed, but she could feel the shift like a ripple under her skin. This wasn't triumph, it was exposure. And exposure comes at a cost. She didn't need a verdict to know what was coming next. Her words would be clipped, taken out of context, looped on the news with headlines like, "Young lawyer sparks chaos in courtroom," or "Racial outburst derails trial." They wouldn't talk about Malik Turner. They wouldn't show the contradictions in the officers' reports. They would fixate on her tone, her volume, her audacity to speak truth in a place built to suppress it. And yet, despite it all, she didn't regret a single word. Not when she looked at the front row and saw Malik's mother silently crying, hands gripping her rosary like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Not when she saw Malik's daughter, now wide awake, clinging to her mother's sleeve with both hands, and not when she turned back to the judge's bench and said, with nothing more than a look, "I'm still standing," because truth always comes with a price, and Jasmine had already decided she was willing to pay it. The courtroom hadn't recovered from Jasmine's statement. Even after Judge Wallace struck his gavel and muttered, "Let's proceed," no one truly did. The gallery was still wide-eyed. The jurors were shaken. The defense fumbled to reorganize. And Wallace, for all his authority, seemed rattled, his usual disdain now shadowed by unease. Moments later, under the guise of preserving order, he recessed the court until Monday morning, claiming the proceedings had become too emotionally charged to continue uninterrupted. But Jasmine knew what it really was: a pause to regain control, a breathing space for the system, not for justice. As the courtroom emptied, the air still humming from her words, she gathered her case files in silence. Her pulse hadn't slowed. Something in the judge's eyes had told her. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping. Something was coming, or being hidden. She was halfway down the marble corridor, heels echoing like warnings, when she noticed a man watching her from near the stairwell. He wasn't in uniform, civilian clothes, late 40s, tired posture, a badge clipped hastily to his belt. DPD Technical Services. Their eyes met. He looked down, hesitated, then walked toward her quickly but discreetly. "Miss Crockett," he asked, voice barely above a whisper, "I need to give you something, but you didn't get it from me." She stiffened, heart already racing. He handed her a plain envelope, no seal, no markings. "Don't open it here," he said. "Just do it somewhere. No one can see you." He turned, walked away. No name, no small talk. Gone. In the privacy of her car, Jasmine tore the envelope open with shaking hands. Inside was a single-page memo, stamped "internal use only," dated 10 days before trial. Her eyes locked onto one line and refused to move. "Audio channel on dash cam disabled manually upon request of supervising officer due to content sensitivity." Her lungs forgot how to breathe. It wasn't a glitch, not a hardware error, not corrupted data. It was erased, intentionally, officially, with bureaucratic precision. The video that could have proven Malik Turner was calm, compliant, and unarmed had been muted on purpose. A silencing that was not only moral but now provable. The next hour blurred into furious typing, evidence cross-checking, and legal fire. Jasmine barricaded herself in her office, phone on silent, blinds drawn, laptop open, case files scattered like a battlefield. Every word of the emergency motion had to hit like a hammer. Formal petition for a judicial order to compel forensic recovery of all dashcam audio files from the night of Malik Turner's shooting. Demand for full metadata, chain of custody logs, and documentation of internal tampering. She cited the memo as Exhibit A, scanned, time-stamped, attached in triplicate. Every paragraph struck with precision, no fat, no fluff, just sharp legal teeth. She ended it with a single line in bold. The silence in this case was not technical, it was deliberate. By 2:41 a.m., the motion was submitted to the clerk's inbox, flagged urgent. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She printed 4 hard copies, threw on her coat, and drove straight to the courthouse. She arrived under the pale glow of the courthouse's exterior lamps, her breath fogging in the cold air, her shoes striking the empty floor like defiance. The building was closed, but she knew the side entrance where night staff rotated. She knocked hard. After a long pause, a security officer opened the door, startled to see her. "I need to see the overnight clerk," she said without blinking. "Now." 10 minutes later, a sleepy staffer appeared behind the bulletproof glass of the record window. Jasmine slid the motion through. "This must reach Judge Wallace's chambers by 9 a.m. It's a matter of judicial integrity, and if it disappears, I will file a federal obstruction complaint myself." The clerk blinked, awake now. He nodded, took the file, and disappeared into the depths of the building. Jasmine walked out into the night without looking back. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt electric, like the air before lightning, because now she had proof. And if the court refused to hear Malik Turner's voice, she would force them to. 2 days later, it arrived. A secure drive, hand-delivered under court order, with a short, sterile note, recovered audio file, unredacted. Jasmine didn't wait. She locked her office door, closed the blinds, inserted the drive, and pressed play. At first, there was only the familiar dashcam footage, Malik stepping out of his vehicle, palms raised, shoulders stiff with fear. But then came the sound, raw, unfiltered, devastating. "I don't have a weapon," Malik shouted, his voice clear, desperate, human. Jasmine froze, her lungs forgetting to function. "I'm not resisting. I'm not doing anything." Then came the shots. 3 sharp cracks, too fast, too final. And then silence. No commands, no warnings, just execution. She pressed pause. Her hands were trembling. This was it. The moment they'd buried, the truth they had wiped from the official record. Not lost, not corrupted, deleted, because it told the story they couldn't defend. She rewound it, played it again. Malik's voice cracked in the same place. The fear in his tone wasn't theatrical. It was real, undeniable, and damning. Jasmine knew exactly what she was holding. Not just evidence, not just audio. She was holding the voice of a dead man the system had tried to erase, and now that voice was back, louder than ever and impossible to ignore. She had listened to his voice in the silence of her office. Raw, terrified, unforgettable. But now it was time for everyone else to hear it too. Not through her arguments, not through transcripts, through Malik Turner himself, in his own words, in his final breath. The courtroom was silent before the playback even began. Not the respectful silence of legal decorum, but something far more dangerous. Anticipatory, unsteady, like a held breath before an earthquake. Jasmine stood beside the monitor, her posture calm but charged, one hand on the remote, the other resting lightly on the evidence table. She looked straight at the jury, then toward the judge. "What you are about to hear," she said, her voice low and clear, "is the truth this court was never meant to hear." Then she pressed play. The screen lit up. The familiar dash cam footage appeared. Malik Turner stepping out of his car, hands raised, movements slow and deliberate. But this time, there was sound. Real sound. "I don't have a weapon," his voice echoed through the speakers, sharp with fear, crystal clear, utterly human. The words slammed into the room like a steel door blown open. "I'm not resisting. Please, I'm not doing anything." And then, bang, bang, bang. 3 rapid shots, then silence. Not silence from the recording. Silence in the room. The kind that feels like the aftermath of a collapse. Someone in the gallery let out a short, involuntary cry. One juror, a middle-aged man who had barely reacted to anything all week, lowered his head and clenched his jaw. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks before she could catch them. Another wiped his glasses, even though they weren't fogged. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't speak. She let the footage roll. Malik's body falling out of frame. The officers shouting contradictory commands over each other after he was already down. She paused the video at the last frame. Malik, face pressed to the concrete, unmoving. Then, and only then, she turned back to the jury. "They said it was a malfunction," she said, her voice steady but with an edge that cut straight through the room. "They said the audio was corrupted, unavailable, irrelevant." She held up the court-stamped memo. But it wasn't. It was deleted. Deleted on purpose. Because someone in the department decided this man's voice didn't belong in their version of the truth. She took a step forward. This wasn't just evidence. It was a human being's last words, and they tried to erase them. The defense team sat frozen, color draining from their faces. Judge Wallace shifted in his chair, visibly rattled for the first time, not just by the evidence, but by how naked the system now looked under the harsh light of exposure. Jasmine continued, her voice now razor-sharp. "Malik Turner did everything they say a black man should do when stopped by police. He followed orders. He raised his hands. He begged for his life, and they shot him anyway." Her words cracked against the wood and plaster like hammer blows. Then they tried to bury the only part of him that could speak for itself. She let that sit. Let them feel the weight of it. Then quietly she whispered, not to the jury, not to the judge, but to the room itself. He was never silent. They just wanted you to believe he was. For a moment, no one could speak. The silence wasn't courtroom etiquette anymore. It was shame. Raw, collective, and too late. And Jasmine, still standing, still burning, had just made them all hear it. Every word, every plea, every bullet, every lie. The door at the back of the courtroom opened slowly, not with the usual force of a bailiff or a late-arriving reporter, but with the hesitant weight of someone caring far more than just himself. Arnold Hayes stepped in, shoulders stiff, eyes lowered, the lines on his face looking carved rather than aged. The courtroom didn't know what to make of him. Some in the gallery whispered. The defense attorney blinked and leaned in to consult his colleague. Even Judge Wallace tilted slightly in his chair, recognizing the name on the subpoena Jasmine had submitted 2 days earlier, but clearly not expecting Hayes to actually show. He walked with a noticeable limp, not from injury, but from time. His hand gripped the rail as he climbed into the witness stand, each step deliberate. Jasmine watched him closely, not to see if he would break, but to measure whether the system had ever truly cracked him at all. The clerk raised her hand for the oath. Hayes raised his in return. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes, he said, but the word didn't come out easily. It was dragged up from somewhere deep. He adjusted the microphone and looked out into the room. His voice when it came was slow, gravel-lined, but steady. My name is Arnold Hayes. I served with the Dallas Police Department for 33 years. I retired in 2017 after spending most of my time training new recruits. He paused. No one interrupted. I'm here because something's been eating at me since I saw the name Malik Turner come across the news. Jasmine stepped forward, no notes in hand. Sergeant Hayes, did you know Officer Keene or any of the officers involved in Mr. Turner's shooting? I knew of them, trained one of them years ago. Not well, but this isn't about them, he said. It's about all of us. The room stiffened. I've seen a lot in 3 decades. But what I saw in that dash cam footage broke something in me. His voice trembled, just for a second. Because it wasn't new. It was familiar, routine, predictable. He leaned forward slightly. We were trained to be alert, yes. Trained to assess threats, stay alive, stay sharp. But between the lines, between the lectures and the manuals, we were conditioned to fear black men. A gasp escaped from the back row. Someone dropped a pen. I won't dress it up, Hayes continued. They didn't say it outright, not in words, but in scenarios, in drills, in the way we were told to react fast when the suspect was aggressive. Always a black man. In the videos we were shown of non-compliant subjects, always black. The body language we were trained to watch for, always tied to black faces. It was everywhere. Subtle, constant, and corrosive. He paused, taking in the faces before him. Some jurors were motionless, others visibly disturbed. Jasmine said nothing. She just let him speak. We called it officer safety, Hayes said. But it wasn't safety. It was fear. Manufactured, injected into us early and reinforced every day. And that fear got people killed. His hands were clenched now, resting on the rail. We didn't teach recruits to de-escalate when the suspect was black. We taught them to assert control. We taught them to dominate. We taught them that hesitation could get them killed, but never asked what fear might do to the people they were confronting. The courtroom had gone still again. I thought the system would change after Eric Garner, he continued. I thought maybe George Floyd would make them see. Then Breonna Taylor. Then Elijah McClain. Each time I said nothing. I wrote letters and never sent them. I retired and told myself I'd done enough. But when I saw Malik Turner, hands up, saying he had no weapon, and then I heard those shots, I realized something that shattered me. He looked directly at the jury. His voice broke. My silence is part of why he is dead. Gasps turned to tears. A woman in the jury box pressed a tissue to her eyes. One man folded his arms tightly across his chest as if to contain something rising inside him. The defense attorney was rigid, pen frozen mid-scribble. I trained officers who went into the streets with fear in their hearts and a gun on their hip, and I never once asked myself if that fear was justified or dangerous. He turned to Jasmine. That makes me complicit. And if I want to leave this world with even a shred of peace, then the least I can do is stop pretending I didn't know. Jasmine approached the witness stand slowly, carefully. Her mouth opened, but no words came. What could she ask that hadn't already been said? What cross-examination could clarify the pain in his voice? Instead, she placed her hand on the edge of the stand and simply nodded. "Thank you, Sergeant Hayes." He nodded back, his shoulders slack now, as if he'd been carrying a secret for decades and had finally laid it down. Jasmine returned to her table without a word. The judge didn't speak. The gallery didn't stir. The silence that followed wasn't defensive or dismissive. It was sacred, a reckoning. For once, in that courtroom, no one needed to argue. No one needed to raise their voice, because the truth had already been spoken. And this time, it stayed in the room. The courtroom was electric, silent, but charged with the kind of tension that made breathing feel like a risk. Everyone was standing now, rows of spectators packed shoulder to shoulder, press huddled in the back with cameras ready. And in the center of it all, Jasmine stood frozen beside the plaintiff's table, her hand resting on the edge like an anchor. The bailiff re-entered with a stiff nod, carrying the folded sheet that would either validate everything or bury it. The foreperson of the jury, a woman in her late 50s with eyes rimmed red, stood and cleared her throat. Her voice shook, but not from uncertainty. "In the matter of Crockett versus City of Dallas," she said, "we, the jury, find the defendant liable. A beat. We find that the City of Dallas bears responsibility in the wrongful death of Malik Turner." Gasps burst from the gallery, raw, involuntary. One of Malik's relatives let out a sob that echoed like a crack of thunder. Jasmine's knees almost buckled, but she gripped the table tighter, jaw clenched, eyes burning. For a moment, she couldn't move. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but nothing could prepare her for the weight of hearing those words. Words the system wasn't supposed to allow. A verdict it had fought to smother. The judge's face was blank, unreadable. The defense attorneys stared straight ahead, their silence louder than any objection they'd ever made. Jasmine exhaled slowly, a single breath that seemed to release months of fury, pressure, and pain. But this wasn't victory. Not really, because Malik was still gone. Justice had spoken, yes, but too late, too costly. And even now, the weight of what it had taken to get here pressed against her chest like a brick. Still, the truth had made it into the record. Not as an outburst, not as an ignored voice, but as a verdict. And that meant the silence that once protected power had finally cracked. The moment the verdict was read, the dam broke. Malik's wife collapsed into her seat, sobbing into her hands, her body heaving with the kind of grief that had been held in check far too long. Their daughter, too young to understand the legal weight of the decision, clung to her mother's side, frightened by the noise but sensing something had shifted. In the front row, Malik's mother, stoic until now, stood slowly, her knees trembling, eyes glistening with tears that refused to be contained any longer. She made her way toward Jasmine, step by deliberate step, through a silence carved open by sorrow and vindication. Jasmine turned, eyes still wet, unsure of what to expect. Without a word, the older woman reached out, her hands weathered but strong, and took Jasmine's hand in both of hers. Her voice cracked with emotion, barely louder than a whisper, but every word hit like thunder. "I didn't believe in you," she said, eyes locked onto Jasmine's. "But you didn't leave us. You didn't walk away." Jasmine felt something inside her shatter and settle all at once. All the dismissals, the headlines, the procedural blocks, the accusations. They had built walls around her. But this tore through them. She tightened her grip around the mother's hands, not as a lawyer, not as a symbol, but simply as one woman holding another in the aftermath of shared loss. Around them, the room buzzed with murmurs, camera shutters, and the sound of justice arriving far too late. But in that circle of contact, skin to skin, soul to soul, none of that mattered. This wasn't closure. It wasn't peace. It was something deeper, quieter, more powerful. Recognition. In the end, Jasmine hadn't just won a verdict. She had restored a voice. And for the first time, Someone who had lost everything could say the words that mattered most. You stayed. The doors of the courthouse creaked open with the weight of history still clinging to their hinges. And when Jasmine Crockett stepped through them, the world outside erupted. A wall of cameras flared like lightning. Reporters surged forward, elbows locked in a quiet brawl for inches of ground. Boom mics hovered just above her head like predators circling prey. The crowd spilled into the streets, hundreds, maybe thousands, held back by yellow tape and weary officers who had spent days trying to contain a movement too large to fence in. She stood on the top step in the full light of the late afternoon sun, not a bead of sweat on her brow, not a quiver in her breath. Behind her, the heavy courthouse doors slowly creaked shut, sealing the verdict inside, but leaving its consequences roaring outside. They had come for a reaction. She was about to give them a reckoning. Flashes snapped, recorders beeped, and then came the voice. A reporter pressed up against the line, voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. Ms. Crockett, do you still believe you were selected just because you're black? The air changed instantly. The crowd's breath hitched. Cameras zoomed. Even the sun seemed to pause behind a cloud. The question was bait, polished, provocative, dangerous, designed to undo her victory with a single misstep. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood still, surrounded by chaos, and looked directly at the reporter. Her silence at first was deafening. Not hesitation, but calculation. She scanned the crowd, students holding protest signs, an elderly couple in church clothes with Malik's photo on a laminated poster, a row of local journalists balancing notebooks on their knees, and behind them, even members of the city council who hadn't dared enter the courtroom, now trying to share its spotlight. She gave them what they didn't expect, a smile, not one of triumph, not one of vengeance. It was a tired, honest smile, a smile that had weathered every objection, every smirk, every procedural slap in the face. She stepped forward, just enough to meet the question head on. Maybe, she said simply, her voice firm, rising just above the crowd's edge. Maybe I was chosen because I'm black. She paused. The cameras blinked wildly like stunned eyes. But I stayed because I was the only one who wouldn't stay silent. The crowd didn't cheer. Not right away, because it wasn't a moment meant for applause. It was meant for reflection, for recognition. The silence afterward was louder than any ovation. It settled over them like gravity. And when the cheering finally did erupt, raw, unscripted, real, it wasn't celebration, it was release. Jasmine nodded once, then turned. She didn't linger for sound bites. She didn't wait for the network vans to catch up. She turned her back to the frenzy and walked down the courthouse steps with slow, grounded purpose. The crowd parted for her, not because they were told to, but because they understood, intuitively, collectively, that this woman had just carried something no one else dared lift. And now she was walking it into history. Behind her, visible through the courthouse's towering glass doors, stood that same wooden chair, the empty one, the one they had placed quietly, almost dismissively, behind the plaintiff's table, a silent placeholder for Malik Turner, whose body was gone, but whose name now thundered through every courthouse corridor and television screen across the country. But now the chair wasn't empty anymore. Now it was full, not with a man, but with memory, with meaning, with the weight of a city's silence, and the voice that had refused to let that silence win. People stopped to photograph it. Some wept. Some knelt beside it. Someone placed a single folded note on the seat. I see you now. Someone else laid a white rose. One young girl, no more than 10, stood in front of it with her hand over her heart, saying nothing, but watching. A drone camera hovered, beaming the image live to millions. The courtroom behind glass, the woman walking away, the chair that no longer blended into the woodwork. And Jasmine, she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, every step echoing not just off the pavement, but off history itself. She didn't need a podium. She didn't need headlines. She didn't need to shout. Her war, had already spoken loud enough. Because sometimes the loudest act of resistance is walking away with your head high, knowing you told the truth in a place built to erase it. And behind her, the chair stayed, still, visible, and finally seen. It began with a single invitation from a third-year student at Howard Law who had seen the trial replayed on the evening news and had watched Jasmine's final statement more times than he could count. That invitation turned into 10, then 20. Within months, Jasmine Crockett, once dismissed as a diversity hire and called too emotional for court, had become the most requested guest lecturer at law schools across the country. Harvard, Columbia, NYU, Spelman, Georgetown, Berkeley. Her name traveled faster than the verdict. But it wasn't celebrity they were chasing, it was reckoning. Jasmine wasn't offering inspiration, she was offering disruption. And when she stepped onto the stage at Yale Law that crisp October evening, the atmosphere didn't feel academic. It felt like a live wire. 1,000 future lawyers packed into the auditorium, crammed against walls, sitting shoulder to shoulder on stairs and floors. No ambient music, no warm-up speaker, just a long electric silence as the moderator nervously introduced her, civil rights attorney, litigator, advocate, and the woman who made the city of Dallas answer for Malik Turner. She walked out slowly, no flashy suit, no entourage, just a navy blazer, loose curls tucked behind one ear, and a folder pressed flat against her side like a shield. The applause that greeted her was thunderous, but Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't bow. She waited for the sound to die like she waited for a courtroom to quiet before dropping the kind of truth that left judges reaching for their gavels. She stood at the podium, looked out over the sea of fresh ambition, and then she spoke, not with rehearsed charisma, but with surgical precision. "I was chosen because I'm black," she said flatly. "They thought that would be enough. Optics, diversity, something they could point to while they buried the truth in procedure and paperwork. But I stayed, because I refused to be quiet, because silence is how people like Malik Turner get erased." The room froze. Phones stopped recording. Pens stopped scratching. It was like she'd sucked the oxygen out of the room and replaced it with fire. "I was trained to think the law was neutral," she continued, voice low but rising. "They told me the courtroom was sacred, that facts mattered more than emotion, that if I just worked hard enough, stayed polite enough, and waited long enough, justice would eventually arrive. But here's the truth. Justice doesn't walk into the courtroom on her own. You have to drag her in, and sometimes she kicks and screams the whole way." A murmur of unease moved through the rows. Jasmine pressed forward. "I watched a judge pretend not to hear a man's dying words, because the audio was missing. I watched police lie on sworn statements, because they knew the system would protect them. And I watched the media try to turn my courtroom into a circus, because they couldn't imagine a black woman standing her ground and winning." She paused. The room was holding its breath. "You'll graduate and think the robe makes the judge fair, that the badge makes the officer honest, that the title makes your client innocent. But don't be fooled. These systems are built to protect power, and power protects itself first." A hand in the third row twitched, hesitated, then lowered. Jasmine saw it and nodded. "You want to ask if it's always this bad, if the system really is that broken." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "I used to think it just needed fixing, but now I know it needs unlearning." Gasps, shifts in posture. One student in the back was already crying silently. She stepped out from behind the podium now, walking slowly along the edge of the stage. Her heels echoed in the heavy silence. "Some of you will become prosecutors, judges, partners at firms that pay more in settlements than they do in salaries. Some of you will argue for companies that fund the very police departments you're trying to reform. And you'll tell yourselves, 'I'm just doing my job.'" She stopped and looked directly at one student in the front row, wide-eyed, shoulders tense. "But here's what I want you to remember. Every time you stay quiet to keep your career safe, you make silence louder. Every time you accept a lie because it's been notarized, you kill something real." She turned back to the crowd. Her voice sharpened. Not louder, just sharper, cleaner. "When I played that video in court, when I made the world hear Malik Turner say, 'I don't have a weapon,' right before he was shot, people told me it was courageous. It wasn't courage, it was obligation. Courage is a choice, But obligation is truth with claws. It won't let you sleep. It won't let you look away. She clenched her fist slightly just once. And if you don't feel that obligation, you shouldn't be holding anyone's life in your hands. Not as a lawyer, not as a judge, not as a juror, not as a human being. The room broke, not into applause, but into stillness. Emotional stillness. One student lowered his phone. Another shut her laptop without saving. A young black woman in the third row wiped her cheek with her sleeve, then sat up straighter. Jasmine returned to the podium and placed her notes face down, untouched. They invited me to speak today because they think I won something, she said. But what I won was a city's shame. What I carried was a man's death. And what I left behind was a chair that no one could ignore anymore. She looked out over the room one last time. You want justice? Start by learning how many doors it won't walk through. Then decide if you're brave enough to break them open. She stepped back. No music played. No moderator returned. The room stood on its own, rising to its feet as one. Some applauding, most just staring. Not at a celebrity, not at a legal scholar, but at a woman who had once been told to stay quiet and instead made the whole world listen. Justice doesn't arrive on time. It drags its feet. It shows up late, bruised and half broken, if it shows up at all. That was the lesson Jasmine Crockett learned in a courtroom where silence was louder than evidence, and procedure was weaponized to strangle truth. She didn't step into that trial with illusions. She knew what she was up against, a judge who had already chosen a side, a defense that mocked her intelligence at every turn, and a system that had trained itself to be numb to the deaths of men like Malik Turner. But what she didn't expect, what hit her like a second bullet, was how easily the world moved on from injustice unless someone dragged them back into the moment and made them look. Really look. It wasn't just about law. It wasn't about rules or objections or admissible evidence. It was about something deeper, something rotting beneath the marble columns and Latin mottos of justice. The idea that some lives are quieter than others, that some bodies fall without echo, and that silence, when polished enough, can pass for due process. Malik Turner didn't die in chaos. He died in clarity, hands raised, voice calm, words recorded, erased. And what almost followed wasn't an investigation. It was a burial of facts, of accountability, of memory. The chair left empty for him in that courtroom wasn't a gesture. It was a challenge. And Jasmine knew the weight of what she carried when she stood beside it. Because the truth is, no system fixes itself. Injustice doesn't self-correct, and silence is not neutral. It's a choice. Jasmine learned that real justice starts where comfort ends. It begins with confrontation, with someone refusing to accept the official version, with someone demanding the missing audio, the missing report, the missing truth. And even when you find it, even when you drag it into the light, it won't speak for itself. You have to give it a voice. You have to stand in a room that was designed to ignore you and force it to listen. Jasmine didn't win because she out-argued the other side. She won because she outlasted a machine designed to grind her down. She won because she refused to sit quietly while others turned pain into protocol. And in doing so, she taught everyone watching, jurors, judges, journalists, and ordinary people, that justice isn't polite. It's not polished. It's not patient. Sometimes justice screams. Sometimes it shows up in a woman who was underestimated, dismissed, and told to smile for the camera while the city buried another black man with legal paperwork instead of a headstone. But maybe the deepest lesson, the one that sat with people long after the news cycle moved on, was this. One person can still make the system shake, not by being loud, but by being unbreakable, by refusing to trade truth for favor, by standing in a courtroom where everything is stacked against you and saying, this life mattered. This lie stops here. Jasmine didn't come to win. She came to testify. And in doing so, she made others testify too. Officers, jurors, citizens, and eventually a city. So if there's a lesson to carry from this story, it isn't just that justice is hard. It's that silence is easier and far more dangerous. It's that too many people have died because no one wanted to make noise. And it's that sometimes the most radical act of all is to speak, to stay, to not walk away even when everything in the system tells you you're not supposed to be there. Because justice doesn't live in courtrooms. It lives in people who refuse to leave empty chairs unnoticed. And now because one woman stayed, the world saw what they tried to bury, and they can never unsee it again. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.